everyone, my name is Kenna, and you will see Michelle here on the next slide in a second. And we are going to analyze the murder of Breonna Taylor and how her death ties into anti-Black gendered violence. We will also discuss the ways in which her experience was not an isolated incident, as well as look at the things that we can do to abolish anti-Black gendered violence as a whole. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks so much for being here.
The history of Black women in slavery. Dating back to the expansion of slavery in the 19th century, enslavers and physicians were obsessed with Black women for many reasons, primarily because of the reproduction system, which was a key to maintaining the system of slavery after the closing of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. Because of this, medical professionals began looking into the female body, which is where the field of gynecology emerged. Physicians would experiment on their bodies, and these medical experimentations continued from 1845 all the way through 1849. Black women had no choice but to withstand these procedures and any service going forward. During the Civil War, many Black women served in official and unofficial capacities during the war. Many served as spies, which is talked about in Chapter 5 of the reading. For example, one of them being Ada Bacon of Florence County, South Carolina. She communicated information through her work on clothesline to track the movement of Confederate officers. This story represents the clandestine ways Black women helped move themselves one step closer to freedom, which is the main reason why they would contribute to the war efforts in hopes of attaining their freedom. Their freedom in a nation that unfortunately rarely respected them or welcomed them. A nation that is still flawed today, as we learned about the unjust case of Breonna Taylor. In an interview with Leo Weekly, Junia Palmer, Breonna Taylor's sister, gets vulnerable on the topic of the representation she sees on behalf of her sister. She goes to say, "I don't like that you only see her in her work uniform. I want people to see when she doesn't get dressed up and she wouldn't be outside, or when she's dressed up and going outside. I want you to see that she's more than this person that worked as an EMT. She was still just an average person." The media and the public failed to bring light onto Breonna Taylor's story and who she was outside of being a Black emergency medical technician in Louisville, Kentucky, who was shot and killed by the police, which is how the hashtag #SayHerName came about in efforts to resurface her story and who Miss Taylor truly was.
The importance of humanizing Breonna and her story. In the video discussing African American women in slavery and freedom, Dr. Deidre Cooper Owens talks about the politics of respectability. The politics of respectability centers around the idea that people have to be respectable, must have certain careers, behave in ways that make white folk especially more comfortable in order to receive basic human rights. If you look up Breonna Taylor's name and story, just on Google, many of the first words describing her are award-winning EMT, model citizen, and so on. This is a problem because it creates the narrative that this was an injustice because she was an EMT, not because she was a person. If she were a Black woman working a career that was deemed less respectable, her story may not have been received with the same level of sympathy or received as much media attention as it did. In the New York Times video investigations, you can see that the SWAT team arrives and processes the weight of the officer's mistake by seeing her uniform. But it's by seeing her uniform that they process this, not because a Black woman has been murdered right in front of them. It's important to humanize Breonna and her story because she was more than just an EMT. She was a person, a wonderful partner, sister, daughter, friend, and so much more. She was a Black woman deserving of the world and of something as simple as feeling and being safe in her own home. The fact that justice has not been served to the police officer shows just how much of an issue it is and how important it is to raise our voices for her, to educate ourselves, and to fight for the justice and protection of Black women everywhere. In addition to this, humanizing her and her story creates opportunities to change the narrative around the countless murders surrounding so many Black women. And this makes room for justice for them. These stories need to be told in their fullness to cultivate a space that strengthens the opportunities for justice, accountability, and reform.
Around midnight on March 13, 2020, Louisville police were conducting an investigation on two men they believe were selling drugs in one of the houses far from Miss Taylor's home. A judge signed a search warrant allowing police to search Miss Taylor's home because police thought they were distributing drugs from Miss Taylor's residence. However, Brianna had cut ties with that man. That night, Miss Taylor and her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, were in bed when they woke up from a loud bang at the front door. When they called out to see who it was, there was no response. The police then barged into the residence using a battering ram, and in doing so startled Mr. Walker, leading him to fire his gun. This then led police to fire multiple gunshots, striking Miss Taylor 5 times. Brianna had received no medical attention for over 20 minutes after she had been shot. No drugs were found in the residence, and on August 27th, Jamarcus Glover had been arrested for the possession of drugs, and he admitted to the court that Miss Taylor was not involved. Coming from the Courier-Journal and Louisville community, some progress has been made the last 2 years, banning the no-knock warrant, hiring a new chief, created a civilian review board, yet no criminal charges were filed. 2 years have passed and still no justice for Breonna Taylor.
The history of anti-Black gendered violence. The violence perpetrated against Black women is older than the United States itself. Chapter 4 of A Black Woman's History of the United States discusses the violence and the types of violence that Black women in particular experience. This violence, especially the violence endured by enslaved Black women, has been rendered invisible or is incomplete history. Chapter 4 covers the horrific experiences forced onto Black women in slavery that are unique to womanhood specifically. An example of this is having their children torn away from them, as well as Black women being used for experimentation for gynecological purposes. Millie and Christine McCoy, who are pictured here, are considered to be the most experimented on Black women of this time and experienced such horrific amounts of violence on their bodies in the name of experimentation and spectacle. So how are these stories, the stories of Millie and Christine McCoy and Breonna Taylor, similar in regards to anti-Black gendered violence? The police officers knew that it was Breonna Taylor's house before they were entering, and they were even explicitly told that it was not necessary to visit her home for the investigation. Given the historical context of the way that Black women are mistreated, there is a precedence to suggest that their lack of preparation and unjustified force is a result of a lack of respect of Black women and a comfort in their violence towards Black women and the Black community as a whole. The comfortability of white men being violent and exploitative of Black women is based on years and years of doing so. Although the horrific stories of Millie and Christine seem dissimilar in nature because of what was happening, they are both state-sanctioned violence. There is also an inherent lack of accountability and justice for white perpetrators causing this violence towards these Black women. So this is not an isolated incident. Anti-Black gendered violence is a reality that Black women have had to face from the moment that they were taken from the shores of Africa. Angela Davis shares her frustration and disbelief when being asked about whether or not she approves of violence. She explains that she was born into a world of violence as a Black woman. She tells a story about a church near her childhood home that was bombed and the closeness that she and her family had with the girls that were murdered. Angela Davis's words are important because it shows the reality of Black women. Even though it's 2022, anti-Black gendered violence is still very prevalent, and it's a reality that Black women have had to face, much like the Black gendered violence that enslaved women had to experience as well.
Tamika Mallory gives such a powerful speech on the topic of Black Lives Matter by addressing the root of the problem, which is the need for action and justice within the Black community. As she and many others around the nation have said, enough is enough. Miss Mallory mentions there is an easy way to stop the enraged youth. That is to charge the cops. Which takes me back to Breonna Taylor's case and many others like hers, where unfortunately no action was or has been taken to do so. She ends the speech with a strong message to America. If you want us to do better, then you do better. And in learning about this history, it shows me that there is still change to be made to abolish anti-Black gendered violence.
So how does learning about this history help us to work to abolish anti-Black gendered violence? As we have seen throughout the stories of Breonna Taylor and other Black women throughout our readings, we continue to see the use of Black women's bodies as a commodity, and in this white supremacist heteropatriarchal society, as disposable. First, to address the violence and experiences of Black women, I want to quickly insert that I am white and non-binary. My perspective on this comes from a place of privilege, and I am actively unlearning racism and white supremacist narratives. I strive to give as best of a perspective as I can with the utmost compassion and care towards Black women and the Black community. So, one thing that is really important, but not enough, is saying these women's names, telling their stories. I think it's important not to stop there, though. That isn't enough. That does not create justice or reparations for these Black women, but it does bring Black women's struggles as a whole to the forefront of the societal narrative. In order to make sustainable change, we need systemic change. We need to dismantle whiteness and white supremacy. We need to dismantle systems that are not inclusive of Black women's experiences, and to create systems that acknowledge the importance of the intersection of Blackness and womanhood that Black women experience. I also want to include the importance of fighting for these things and the intersection and inclusion of Black women, trans women as well. Black trans women are disproportionately the victims of fatal violence and have an incredibly high unemployment rate and rate of homelessness. So policy really needs to reflect their unique experiences and protect them as well. To successfully abolish anti-Black gendered violence, we also need to address the abolition of systems that perpetuate white supremacy. Examples of this are the school-to-prison pipeline, the prison system itself, which reflects slavery in many facets, the abolishing and reform of the police, and upheaval of the ways in which we in the United States are taught history in schools as well. We must demand serious change to law enforcement and the ways in which law enforcement and systems treat Black people. In addition to this, systemic change can come from education as well, taking classes such as this one, which I am learning an immense amount, reading books written by Black women, decolonizing our bookshelves and the education system as a whole, teaching critical race theory in schools about Black women's experiences, specifically and in particular to educate ourselves and the younger generations about the violence that Black women in the Black community have had to endure for centuries. Finally, to abolish anti-Black gendered violence, we need policy-driven work that focuses on rehabilitation and reparations, policies that work on creating and providing these resources for Black people, policies for healthcare, to provide adequate education for doctors and healthcare workers, to provide mental health services for Black women, and so on. It is our responsibility to dismantle white supremacy and to educate ourselves on these things. I am striving to be a part of this work going forward in my education, as well as the work that I do moving forward. In addition to this, I will be educating my 2-year-old daughter at home and raising her in an anti-racist household. I am so grateful and humbled taking this course. Black women deserve to be lifted up and celebrated and cherished, and I am so grateful to be a part of sharing Breonna Taylor's story and the importance of understanding her experience in its fullness in the fight for abolition of anti-Black gendered violence. Thanks for listening.